I can't really think of a good introduction for this one, so I will just say I'm Adam, a climate scientist with a PhD from Oxford, sharing what you need to know about climate change. And I'm joined today by my friend Ella Gilbert, aka Dr. Gilbs. Who are you?
I'm a polar climate scientist with a PhD in, polar climate change, and I run a channel called Dr. Gilbs.
And today, more than most days, you need to know about Donald Trump and climate change. So on Ella's channel, we're going to be making a video really reacting to some of the things Donald Trump has said specifically. This video that you're currently watching is much more about what actions we think we might be able to expect. Hey, future Adam here, and now that I'm editing this video, I realise I completely forgot to mention that it's been shaped by all of you. I asked my patrons over on Patreon, as well as my community here on YouTube, what questions you had about the second Donald Trump presidency, and well, you had a lot of questions. Me and Ella tried to tackle as many of them as we possibly could, so yeah, let's get back to that video. Now, probably a good place to start is by looking at the first presidency.
What a car crash. I think the first thing to say is that he rolled back a lot of things that had already been set in motion, and there were a lot of anti-science and anti-environment policies that were implemented, and I imagine that this one is going to be, if not the same, then worse.
I guess some of the headlines of that anti-science-ness were leaving the Paris Climate Agreement, rolling back over 100 environmental regulations within the United States, appointing Scott Pruitt, who was a major climate denier, to the EPA. I'd kind of forgotten about so many of these things, to be honest. I feel like I blanked a lot of them from my memory once we'd got past the first Trump presidency. But on top of all these things, I think what we can expect, oh my God, it sounds so cliche, is the unexpected. Like, if Trump's first presidency was defined by anything, it was its unpredictability.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, in his anti-science rhetoric was, anti-vaccination, using crazy recommendations in the world of health, and he's specifically very anti-climate hoax, what he calls. So it's very much an attack on climate science.
And this has had really big knock-on effects outside of America as well. We mentioned already that the US left the Paris Climate Agreement. This had profound effects on negotiations, as at one of the COPs, the big climate negotiations which happen every year, and actually have just kicked off as we're filming this video. But I was at one of the COPs while Trump was president for the first time, and it just really set the tone for everything that was going on. It was the subtext, or just the text, of all the discussions that were taking place.
Definitely, and colleagues who are in the COP29 negotiations right now are saying that this US election result is really setting the tone for this negotiation.
It's tricky because obviously Trump isn't president right now. Joe Biden is still president. No one's quite sure what that's going to mean or what to do with it right now, but that's not going to stop us from trying to say we know what it means. So looking forward to this presidency, the one coming up, what can we expect?
What we can expect for this presidency that sets it apart from the last one is a more clinical approach and a more targeted dismantling of certain policies like Biden's Inflation Reduction Act and what Donald Trump calls this Green New scam. He's going to look to either rescind policies that are already in place or kind of stop anything from going ahead that is already sort of in motion but hasn't happened yet. I think the sort of things we saw with appointing climate deniers for the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, he's going to try and dismantle lots of federal agencies that are in charge of things like environmental protection or climate action. So I think he's going to use his learnings from the last presidency and his mistakes, and I fear do it better than he did last time.
And one of the reasons that we can expect things to be done better this time around is because there's really a blueprint this time around. There's Project 2025, which isn't climate specific, but definitely has a lot on climate, using phrases like climate alarmism when referring to climate change, and generally tries to roll back as much as possible. And now, crucially, all of this will have really material impacts on the US's emissions. I hear a lot of people who say things like, oh, it wouldn't have made a difference either way between Harris and Trump. But at least when it comes to climate change, we see that Trump is very likely to put us on a trajectory with substantially more emissions, 4 billion tons of carbon dioxide extra emissions. To put in context just how big 4 billion tons of carbon dioxide is, that would basically cancel out all the carbon dioxide savings we've seen from renewables, from green energy implementations the world over the last 5 years. And it should be added that the progress we had made under Joe Biden wasn't enough. And so this is taking that kind of first tentative step and really undoing it.
If not making it, a lot worse, because Donald Trump is famously very in favour of fossil fuels and loves all of his buddies in the fossil fuel industry. So he wants to boost all of that fossil fuel production. And the US is already a huge consumer of fossil fuels and a producer of greenhouse gas emissions.
It's worth bearing in mind through all of this that what matters when it comes to emissions, as far as the atmosphere is concerned, is how much has been emitted over all time. And when looked at that way, America is the biggest emitter of all time. And so what happens in America does not stay in America, which takes us neatly onto the Paris Climate Agreement. I mentioned that the last Trump presidency saw the US leave the Paris Climate Agreement. Are we expecting more of the same this time around?
Almost certainly. He did this pretty much as soon as he came into power last time, and it's pretty much expected he'll withdraw the US from the Paris Climate Agreement again as soon as he comes into power. What he's also talking about doing, and what people are talking about him doing, is him leaving the framework that sort of organises the Paris Agreement. It's unclear whether that will actually work out or not, because it seems almost pointless and actually maybe legally a bit dubious.
It's called the UNFCCC to nerds like
snappy
us.
Name.
Snappy title. But actually, I first heard about the fact this was being considered from Ella. I was just like, what? It doesn't make any sense. No. It basically just means America saying, we don't even want to sit at the table to talk about things. Yeah. It means America saying, we don't have any say in what's going on in the international community. And it's very hard to even understand what the benefit would be other than just international posturing. But there is a lot of stuff that the US could also do on the international stage which would have very material consequences. For example, when it comes to climate finance.
Yeah, and the US has so far contributed to global climate financing a very paltry amount. It's about 3 billion. We need huge, so much more financing to enable adaptation and to enable developing countries to implement the sorts of actions that will reduce that global total of carbon emissions. And the US has so far chipped in 3 billion, and I imagine that Donald Trump will completely curtail any further contributions.
It's worth really emphasizing that climate change is an issue that's primarily caused by the richest countries and the richest people within countries, and primarily felt by the poorest countries and the poorest people within countries. And broadly taken, climate finance is something that tries to address that imbalance.
Yeah, that 100 billion figure has always been too low, really, because it doesn't even go anywhere near as far as it needs to address that imbalance.
And then throughout all of this, the elephant in the room, well, actually, I guess the elephant in the room is Donald Trump, but the elephant in the room is the 1.5 degree temperature limit. So the Paris Climate Agreement set out to limit global temperatures well under 2 degrees and ideally under 1.5 degrees of warming. Even when the agreement was signed, that 1.5 degree limit was understood to be very ambitious but very important for protecting especially the most vulnerable people and ecosystems across the world. Well, it's been quite a few years since Paris and we haven't made the progress that we need to, and then there's this Donald Trump presidency. Where does that leave with the 1.5 degree limit, do you think?
What a question to leave me with. I don't think it leaves us in a good place, but to be quite frank, we weren't in a good place to start with. There's a lot of kind of vagueness around that 1.5 degree target.
It's generally understood that we probably haven't passed it yet in terms of how we interpret the limit, but we're incredibly close.
Yeah, and regardless of whether we have breached it or not, it's not a hard line in the sand. Every single fraction of a degree matters. Every single emission of greenhouse gases matters. 1.49 is no materially better than 1.51. It's all a spectrum, and every increment of warming that we can avoid is going to be valuable.
I've seen some people argue that, it's going to be really hard to convince the world to take action or people to take action because specifically we might well be overshooting the 1.5 degree limit. And that's just absolutely not how we need to be thinking about this. There's a world of difference between 1.5 degrees and 1.6 degrees and 1.7 degrees and 1.8 degrees. And at no point do we get to throw up our hands and say, well, we've passed this, so it doesn't make any difference anymore. Climate action now, I guess, is more important than it ever has been, especially to try and make up for the lackings in climate action that I think we can expect. And on that note, I think there are some mitigating factors, both within the United States and outside it.
The US and people who are pro-climate action in the US have put in some measures that will protect the things that have already been agreed, signed on, and implemented. And there are lots of policies that will continue regardless. There are also some policies that are just a no-brainer, like they provide jobs in states that are, or let's be real, Republican states, and they are going to continue because they provide jobs, they stimulate the economy.
There's a lot, obviously, in America which happens at the countrywide level, but there's also a lot that happens on the local level, or the state level, or the city level. Just in this last election, obviously the headline is that Donald Trump won, but there were also a lot of environmental policies that passed in particular states. There's a lot that can happen at the grassroots to state levels as well within America.
And I think that's also something that we're going to see elsewhere. I mean, the US is just one country, albeit a really big, really important country when it comes to climate action. Actually, that sort of action is happening worldwide at the grassroots level, at the local level, at the national level, and at the international level. And it means that other countries are going to pick up the slack, I hope. There is a lot of good stuff happening elsewhere that is actually making meaningful differences.
I've been reading a lot of comments from experts, from climate policy experts, climate science experts, and some people are maybe more negative about how this will impact the international progress. Others really think that other countries will step up and step in and see it as an opportunity to outdo the United States. On top of all that, it's really worth emphasizing that we're in a really different position than we were 8 years ago. There's a much bigger climate activist movement, and renewables, solar and wind, have continued to get cheaper and cheaper to the point where in many contexts they're the cheapest way of getting your electricity. So there are all these ways in which the wheels are already spinning, and that Donald Trump won't necessarily be able to stop those wheels spinning. And now obviously this whole discussion that we've just been having has been very broad strokes and maybe a bit abstract. And just a reminder, we've got a whole other video on Ella's channel to complement this video. Ella, what's that video going to be about?
So we're going to be reacting to things that Donald Trump has already said and thinking about what that means for climate and debunking some of the, quite frankly, bonkers stuff that he has said.
So we're actually filming this video first. I've not seen the clips that Ella's chosen, and I just had a slight sinking feeling in my stomach when Ella was describing that. But I would like to leave with this thought that has been in my mind a lot. I have been thinking a lot about mangroves, and mangroves are these natural climate champions. Not only are they incredible at grabbing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it, but they help protect land when storms strike. Mangroves soften the blow of those waves. And so I've been thinking a lot that we all need to be a little bit more like mangroves over the next 4 years. Okay, that's it from us. Until next time. Bye. America.
Yeah.